Okay, welcome back. This is video number 7 of the Makerspace Learn to Knit series, and we were talking about circular needles, we were talking about double pointed needles. We've decided that we're going to knit a headband, and that the headband is going to have a pattern stitch of ribbing. So let's talk a little bit about ribbing. What is ribbing? Why do we like it? How is it different from stockinette stitch? If you remember, do you remember our original swatch, the ugly swatch? So the ugly swatch had a bunch of different things going on in it. What it did have on the bottom was this flat, nice section of stitches, all tiny little V's, all of them, well, except for the border. And this is called stockinette stitch, which means that on the right side, which is facing us, all the stitches are knits, okay, in that section. Also means that in stockinette stitch, on the back side, on the wrong side, all of these stitches are purls. So if we're working stockinette stitch on the right side, we knit, 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 knit. This is some garter stitch, ignore that. And then we, on the back, all of these stitches are purl, 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 all the way across. Okay, so that's how stockinette stitch goes. When we're knitting in the round, we're not flipping anything. So it looks more like this, and basically we're just knitting, this is the only side we see, is this part. So we're just round and around and around and around, knits all the time. So that's why some people like circular knitting, is because it's more knitting than purling, which for most people, knitting in most styles is a little bit easier to knit than it is to purl, or at least less motion. It's not true for every knitting style. There are styles where purling is actually easier. But for the main two, which are English American style and continental German style, most people like to knit more than they like to purl. So that is that. So let's talk about ribbing. Ribbing is different. It's not going to be smooth like this. It's going to look different. This is what ribbing looks like. This is another little swatch. And so it looks different. You still see knit, 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 but it has ridges on it. Ribbing is a pattern of alternating knits and purls, so that the same sequence you're doing over again. So knit, 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 purls, knit, purls, knit, purls, all the way across. The knits are going to be the ridgy part, and the purls are going to be the valleys. So you can't, the nature of ribbing is that the purls hide a little bit. So if I'm looking at this, pretty much all I see are V's. Whereas when we looked at, some other stitches, when we looked at the middle of this, we can see those are the purls, V's, 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 purls, V's, V's, V's. So you can kind of see a little bit better where the purls are here. And you can definitely see that these are on this side easier. These are all purls, and these 3 ridges are just the knits on the wrong side. So a little bit easier to see purls there, easier to see the knits here. But on our swatch, because it's just all ribbing, it kind of just looks like all knits. So where are the purls? Ha, there they are. They are hiding. The nature of the purls pulling to the back and the knits pulling to the front is what makes ribbing so stretchy. I mean, this stretches probably from just a couple inches, pretty almost double its size, and then it'll come back. So the nature of ribbing is very useful for things like cuffs. You'll see on sweater knit cuffs, on waistbands, on necklines, on anything that needs to stretch and return back to a shape. That's where you'll see a lot of ribbing. Ribbing is great for things like hats. A lot of times a hat will have the brim just done in ribbing, and then the main part of the hat done in something else. Sometimes you can have a hat that's just all ribbing. Our headband is going to be all ribbing. So because it's going to be stretchy and it's going to go over our head, and then when we take it off, we want it to spring back. Also, we don't want our headband falling off. So if we make it too big, it's not going to stay on our head and keep our ears warm. It's just going to keep slipping off and being annoying. So we want to take that into consideration too when we're figuring out what we're actually going to make, how we're going to make our headband, how many stitches, how big, that kind of stuff. So it's a pattern of ribbing. And you can do any combination, really, of knits and purls, but it has to be in the same sequence as you go along so that it creates a ridge, so that the rows all line up. So I'm not sure if you can see here, but in this we see 3 V's, so that's a knit 3, and if you can see here, there are 2 purl stitches. It's kind of hard to see on that side, but the opposite you can see definitely much more easily that there are 2 purl stitches on the right side, which would show up as knit stitches on the back side. Now this is reversible, really. Like you could decide, like what if this was you decided that this was your right side, and what you have is knit 2 purl 3 rib. It would be the opposite of the knit 3 purl 2 rib on the front. So sometimes, let's say you did knit 2 purl 2 rib, that would be completely reversible. It would look pretty much exactly the same on both sides. So when you're ribbing on a flat piece, whatever's knit on this side is a purl on that side. A knit 3 purl 2 ribbing on the front side would become a purl 3 knit 2 ribbing on the wrong side. Since we will be knitting in a circular way, we'll be knitting in the rounds, we're never going to deal with the wrong side at all. So all the way around in our circle is going to be this stitch pattern, which is what we will always see. So we will always be going knit, 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 purl, purl, knit, 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 purl, purl, all the way around. We don't have to worry about doing the opposite at any point. This is what we're doing for this pattern. It may be different in other patterns, but for our purposes, it's going to be the same all the way around, which is pretty cool because you won't really have to think a whole lot once you get going with this pattern. Another thing about ribbing, just so that there's any combination of ribbing. So you could have knit 1, purl 1. You could have knit 2, purl 2. You could have knit 3, purl 2. You can have any combination. Technically, the stretchiest type of ribbing is a knit 2, purl 2 rib. Just obviously they've stretched different swatches, and the knit 2, purl 2, because of its construction, stretches the most. So any combination that is not knit 2, purl 2 will be to some degree less stretchy. However, all ribbing is somewhat stretchy. Knit 3, purl 2 stretching, I'm not quite sure if you would tell a difference between knit 3, purl 2 and knit 2, purl 2. The difference would probably be negligible. But it looks a little bit different. It's a little bit, a little bit different, a little bit more challenging than just 2, 2, 2, 2. So, because you got to watch what you're doing and flip from doing knits to purls in the right sequence. And so you actually have to do, for the first bit, a bit of counting. So that's one thing to consider. So other good things about ribbing are that if I just set this down by itself, not holding it, it's pretty flat. It's not rolling, it's not curling. The edges are curling just a tad because I have knit stitches on the edges, and the nature of knit stitches is that they want to curl to the back. If I had this stretched out, though, you would see it's not really curling or doing anything. Whereas if you see, remember how I was struggling at some points with this swatch and it would keep turning over at the top? That's because this top is all stockinette. And it's bound off stockinette. There's no border at the top at all. There's just bound off stitches. Whereas there's a border on all 3 sides the other sides of this swatch. So this is just going to lay flat because it has a border which is keeping it from curling. Stockinette stitch by its nature always just wants to curl. It wants to curl in. Stockinette stitch is great, but it does have that curling problem. If you do have something flat or something that is predominantly stockinette stitch based, you may have a curling problem. Sometimes the curling can be taken care of by a good blocking. Blocking is soaking or wetting or steaming your piece of knitting and then laying it out and pinning it or laying it out in a way that it's a little bit more flat, sometimes weighing it down. Sometimes that'll do the trick, but most of the time with stockinette stitch you will need some sort of border. In this case, our border is garter stitch. Garter stitch on the right side has a balanced number of knits and purls, meaning that garter stitch is really 1-for-1. It's 50% knits and 50% purls because you're knitting across, you're purling across, you're knitting across, and that's what creates those ridges on the front side. But other things that have balanced purls and knits generally is ribbing, and that's why ribbing is great for edges as well, because the edges are not going to curl. A perfectly balanced ribbing would be a knit 1, purl 1, or a knit 2, purl 2. This is slightly unbalanced in that it has a little bit more knits, so you might see a little bit, I don't know, not even really. It's a stretch to see it, but really a fairly balanced number of purls or knits is what's going to give you an edge or a piece of fabric that's not going to curl like a stockinette would. So this has even been blocked and played with a lot, and it's still, the edge still wants to curl up. So just keep that in mind when you are looking at patterns that are predominantly stockinette stitch based. Any pattern that has a balanced number of knits and purls will give you a flat edge. Not just garter stitch, it could be garter stitch, it could be ribbing, it could be something called moss stitch, which you can look that up and see what that looks like, something called seed stitch, which is something also that doesn't really look like this, that looks a little bit different, but still is balanced enough to make a border. So you can check that out. There's lots and lots of stitches. If you look in a stitch dictionary, if you just look up Stitch Dictionary and click images on your browser, you will see tons and tons and tons of stitches. It's really very cool the amount of stuff that you can do with just a combination of knits and purls. Nonetheless, when we get into increases, decreases, yarn overs, lace type stuff, cables, there's really just so much you can do, and that's why there's so many design possibilities with knitting that don't really exist in any other medium. So it's pretty cool what you can do, but definitely the flatter stitches are what's good for borders. If you are designing or making up your own pattern for something that's going to be flat, you want to incorporate that probably on the edges. So in circular knitting, we said we work round and around in a spiral. It's all the right side all the time. So that's why it's popular to knit in the round. That's why long tubes are easy to do, because you just keep going and going. And that's a little bit about ribbing versus stockinette.